Alright, so the next stage is to do a little bit of assembly, and we're going to start with these two, and then to that set we'll add the SD card, and these will form the base of the stack. We don't need to add the RTC to it like we did with some of the previous builds in 2017, because we've got enough room inside the logger housing to spread them out. That makes the assembly a bit easier. So we start with our screw terminal board. And again, the key thing is getting the orientation correct. This is our UART pins. There's TX and RX, and I want to make sure that I'm aligning with the labels that are on this nano board. That'll get my digital pins in alignment with the labels. The analog pins will not match because it's not the same Arduino. But if we've done all our work correctly in the first place, these should line up. Sometimes it's a bit awkward, you know, and you have to just sort of rock it gently into place. And it looks like we're going to have luck today. Wow. Okay, that's about as good as it ever gets. Sometimes it is highly annoying and it doesn't go together near as well as that. And I'm just going to push these little pins down gently with the back of a cutter just to make sure they're inserted properly, and they are. Same with these. See, now those sank down a little bit because they were not quite inserted. These ones are fine. Okay, so now we've got the Arduino board mounted on the SD board, or sorry, the screw terminal board, and we labeled the grounds on the bottom and on the outside, and I'm going to do the same thing. This is two of those 3.3 volt rail connections. And it's just easier later on for identification if you can take these and just put some marks on the outside, and that just reminds you where your rail connections are. And we carried one all the way over to this side, so there's a positive rail connection there, and that just makes life easier. When you're trying to hook up your sensors, you can identify right away where your ground and power locations are.
So those are the power pins that are available for powering sensors.
Yeah.
Which means that they're connecting to the Arduino beyond, on the other side of the power regulator. So it's regulated power.
This is regulated power. Right. That's what we've labeled here.
So it's usable for sensors.
Usable for sensors. Okay, so next step is to put a little bit of tape on there and put the SD board in place. Now we already have a layer on the SD board, and so I just need to cut a piece from this. Again, we're using the 5-pound here.
And the 5-pound is gray.
Yeah, it's gray on the bottom.
And the 20-pound is black.
Is black. So I'm just trying to make sure I don't want this tape to extend past the edges, so I'm just sort of lining it up, and I'll do a little bit more trimming here.
I mean, you can take the 5-pound tape off.
Yeah, that's why I use it, actually. The 5-pound tape, I use it for these stacks because if I have to repair something later, you really can't take the 20-pound off without damaging something. Whereas you can
might rip a chip off the board.
Yeah, no, it's too strong for the stack of the components. It's great for attaching things to the housing. And just trimming a little excess off there. Okay, so there's tape, and it ideally should cover all of the pins. You don't want the SD board touching down on anything, and it's really on this side that's an issue. So there's one layer of tape, and that is going to mate with the layer that we put on the bottom. So we can just carefully strip that away. Oh, well, that's what happens.
Sticky but not too sticky.
Sticky but not too sticky. The strength of these bonds increases with age, but since we just put this on, it's having some difficulty. And the one thing you want to be careful about is the alignment. If you get the alignment done nicely on this thing, it actually makes the connections easier because they're in the right place. And it's a little hard to show this on screen. Oops. But you want the SD board to overhang. You want the SD board over those extension pins a little bit so that the first two wires are sort of off the edge of the Arduino board. And I'm just going to do this by eye. It takes a little bit of practice. It's not the end of the world if it's misaligned, but I've kind of got this sort of hanging onto the space of those excess pins here.
If it's your first time doing this, it's actually really good to take the SD board while it still has the red tape on the double-sided tape and actually like pre-fit it and just get a feel for how it should sit before you actually try and stick it down.
So horizontally, the alignment is that this board extends out a bit. It's now sitting over those two added pins that we added, and from above you want to make sure that this board is actually sort of almost perfectly aligned with the Arduino. It's the same width, and you want to be able to access these screw terminals without hitting the shield on this plate. So you've still got to be able to get a screwdriver in on here. You'll have to remove the SD card for that, but you don't want the plate blocking your access to these screw terminals. Okay, so once that's in place, you give it a little wiggle, the tape will bond. It doesn't have to be, you know, bulletproof. Usually the first thing I do is the ground wire. So that's the black wire on this end, and I'll bring it across. So that it's just sort of, it's not, I don't want it under tension, but I don't want a whole lot of excess. So I'm just going to hold that wire in place over the screw terminal with my thumb, and then you trim it about 5 millimeters, quarter of an inch past the bottom of the board, and then just strip and twist the wire. And this is what I like about the screw terminal board in general, is that it's very fast to do this stage. Interestingly, NASA prefers dry connections like this over soldered connections because there's so many chemistry issues that arise with soldering and flux and whatnot. A lot of the connectors are specified as crimp connectors when you look at the aerospace industry, just because this kind of connection.
You might have noticed that there's no tinning on these wires when they go into the screw terminal, and that's really important actually.
Yeah, I made the mistake of tinning these guys in some of the early builds, and what happens is the tin squishes, and the net result of that is that your connection gets looser. If you tin these pins, it actually becomes a problem later. You want these wires to be just stripped dry.
Yeah, the solder is just so deformable over time you actually lose your connection.
Okay, so there's my power connection, and I'm running that over to one of the ones we just labeled here. Give it a little twist.
Just a mechanical dry connection.
Yep.
When you're doing this, you do want to twist them really nicely. You want to make sure that you don't have one of the multi-strands sticking out on the side, because again, that's one of the risks of having a short circuit. So twisting neatly is actually a very good habit to get into.
Okay. Power ground, and if we got our alignment correct, these guys will be almost perfectly set up. So the first two, the gray and the orange, come almost straight down. These are the three excess connectors that we added, so one of these is already used. It's the A6 pin, which is receiving the input from our voltage divider, and then the A7 pin is still available. But the next set down here, the labels on this screw terminal adapter do not apply, but if we look at the pins on the Promini, that'll be pin 13, 12, 11, and 10, and those are exactly the SPI connections we need for this SD card. So it from here it's pretty quick, and I'm just going to race through these connections. The first two go straight down, and the last two cross over and go nearly straight down, so we end up bringing the wires down about there. Alright, so that's our 4 SPI bus connections, and again you have to know where the pins are on the Promini to know which these are. That's the pins 13 to pin 10, does not match what's written here, and the ground and the power connection. So the SD card adapter is now connected. We have one more component to add, which is the indicator LED. And we use a common cathode indicator LED, and I always keep sort of a cheat sheet around as to which of the connections is which, because if you buy different LEDs they might have a different standard. In this case it's red, ground, green, and blue, but you know, you have to check when you buy them. And the neat thing about that is that you can always check these just with a coin cell. If you put a coin cell between the pins, you can tell from the color that comes out of your LED if the colors match what you think they do. So always do that check if you get a chance. Again, just the same coin cell you use to power the RTC, you can quickly just flip it between the ground and the other color pins and it'll tell you what's what. So the way I use these common cathode LEDs, I only put a resistor on the ground side if it's simply an indicator, and you only need the one limit resistor on the ground pin, which in this one is this guy right here. So I'm just going to pull that back, and then these other pins I'm just going to bend them with a pair of pliers here so that I can insert them into pins 4, 5, and 6 on the digital side of our Promini. So I'll just give them a 90-degree bend, and I'll have to add a resistor to the ground line, which is the one that I've extended here. So I'm going to give that an angle, and then we'll be adding some tin and we'll stick a resistor on that guy. So let's do that.
You can always read the color bands on the resistor, but do you want to test the resistor?
Not really. I got a 4.7K. This is not a high tolerance, or rather a tight tolerance idea. This is just a limit resistor for the LED, and you can use many different values for this. I'm just choosing a 4.7 because I have it convenient, but you can use anything up to a 30K if you really want your datalogger to have a very low power use. You can really crank that resistor up. Most people end up following the recommendations of a 1K resistor, but for logging applications power is much more valuable, so I tend to use fairly large resistors. 4.7s still gives you enough luminosity out of the LED that you can see it.
Well, it dims the LED brightness.
That's right. When you increase the limit resistor, it gets much dimmer, but it also uses less power, and that's always a consideration for logging applications.
Well, I found, like, if I'm out in the field and I'm trying to check a unit, there's an LED that needs to blink. I mean, the worst case scenario is I put a towel over my head while I'm looking at it, but half the time I have to do that even if it's a bright LED anyway.
Yeah, in the sun, none of these guys are bright.
Oh,
but
yeah.
in a cave, you know, where most of your stuff goes, you know, even a tiny little blink is completely visible.
No, but if I'm on the surface and about in full sunshine or something, it's like I said, the worst case scenario is having to put a t-shirt or a towel over my head while I'm watching it.
Yeah, that does get a little awkward, but
On the other hand, it often buys, you know, significant extension of the lifespan of the logger.
alright, so there's my limit resistor, and I'm gonna clip the ground pin and just attach the limit resistor right to it. And this is one of those places where it might be a good idea to put a little bit of heat shrink tubing just to cover up that resistor a bit.
Oh, you're using dark heat shrink. I have a preference for transparent
I know,
heat shrink.
like, yeah, which makes sense. In teaching situations, you should pretty much always.
Well, when you deploy in the field and maybe sometimes there is corrosion.
Yeah, you can't see it.
You can't see it in the dark heat shrink.
You know what? You're right. From the point of view of, I guess I'm just being vain here, it's prettier to use the dark stuff, but it is not actually the right choice from a point of view of serviceability. And
this is easy because you already opened all your screw terminals early on in the build.
I did, and these pins are a little long for my taste. I'd prefer the LED to be closer, so I'm going to trim these guys down a bit.
Remember to have your safety glasses on when you do the pin trimming.
Yes, Dr. Battles.
I like having functional eyeballs.
Alright, yeah, do as she says, not as I do. Anyway, if you've got your alignment set up, this is very easy to put this indicator LED on here. Again, I'm not using pin 3. Pin 2 is going to get used for the alarm from the RTC, and you want to save pin 3 for another alarm like that. A lot of sensors will produce alarm signals, and you only have 2 hardware interrupts on a Promini. That's on D2 and D3. So don't make the mistake of using up that valuable interrupt pin just for something as simple as an indicator LED. So there's D2 and 3, and those are left alone. One I'm going to use right away.
You've also importantly placed the LED so that you can still get the SD card in
oh
the
yes,
holder.
Of course, the SD card has to go in there, so you don't want this in front of that either. So these just work, but it's arbitrary. You can put the LED wherever you like. I'm just going to...
Sometimes you just have to bend it down a bit.
I'm going to trim this and bend it in. So there's our common ground line going into one of those grounds. Alright, so there's our 3-color indicator LED on 4, 5, and 6. And that completes this part of the stack. We need to, of course, put an SD card in there. And the next step is to add some tape. Now that the conformal coating on the bottom is nice and dry and hard, this should be pretty easy to do.
So you need 3 layers of tape, right?
Yeah, 3 layers, just so that the tape extends past these pins, because otherwise it'll rock back and forth on the pins. And I usually just sort of place a little line along that edge. And then trim it down. And if you're careful, you can just use the edge of the board as your guide for the rest of the trimming. Again, being careful not to cut the wires you just worked so hard to make in the process.
You're going to need the 20-pound tape.
Yes, because the last layer has to go onto the plastic.
Yeah, the plastic of the boxes is just so smooth, it just needs the 20-pound tape to actually get a grip on it.
Yeah, this 5-pound tape doesn't work so well. It works great on circuit boards and most components, but it doesn't quite have enough gumption for a pure plastic surface. So usually the last layer is the black 20-pound tape. Yeah, that's 2 layers of gray.
Okay. And again, I mean, this is really just to build up a thickness so that the pins are not actually pushing the board away from the housing, so that it'll actually stick properly.
Yeah, and there's also these resistors from our battery monitoring divider that'll, if that's the high point, it'll just rock back and forth and it'll never bond properly to the housing.
Yeah, and storing those pieces on the outside of the roll is just great.
Yeah, you don't want to waste. I mean, this tape is too valuable to waste, so whatever you didn't use, you just stick it back on there. Okay, so now this component has combined the screw terminal, the Arduino, the SD card holder, and the LED. So this is
ready for testing.
Ready for testing. We could put an SD card in here. Let me see if I got one of those lying around. Alright, so this was that alignment.
Did you find one?
Yeah, I've got one here. So you want to make sure you haven't accidentally put your LED in the way of that. And now that I'm doing this, I probably should have tested this carrier. I inadvertently trusted that the carrier was not broken, but occasionally you get a bum board and the springs are no good, and you can tell when you put it in if it's giving you a nice solid connector. Some of them don't, and we still don't actually know if this board has a soldering area inside. So at this stage, you can plug it in and run one of the testing utilities just to establish communications with the SD card, just as we did earlier when we were testing the Arduino itself. You know, as soon as you have the ability to, it's a good idea to do the testing stage. But for now, I'm just going to call this part of the build ready to insert into the housing. We'll probably take this back out because we're going to use some of these connections in that process, and so you need access to these screw terminals. But for now, that's kind of the majority of the logger itself put together.